Welcome back to another YouTube video, and today we're gonna try something new. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I posted this a week or so back regarding possibly doing some more Q&As in a YouTube format, because on Instagram there's only so much you can be able to usually answer in a small clip or just in an essay long text if people even read it, versus YouTube I can be able to cover that in a lot more detail. As well, if you follow my YouTube channel for a while, you notice the upload frequency has decreased a bit, and that really isn't because I don't have time, it's because there's only so many topics I feel like I can cover that would actually be warranted without trying to force it. Now, obviously if you follow on Powerlifting Now and you subscribe there, we have monthly releases, and that's where I do all my long form content, and every single month there's a new topic on there. But on YouTube, I only want to put stuff out if I really think it's going to be useful for people to be able to digest. If it's something really generic, I don't think that's worth putting out there. There's hundreds of other videos that cover generic topics. So I would like to do this Q&A format and see how it goes. And if it's something that you all like, I definitely can keep doing this, as this is a very easy format to be able to make videos with. So with that said, let's get into the questions. I think I have about 12 or 13 I'm gonna go through here, and I'll make sure to be able to put a little picture on this screen so you can be able to see the question as I'm reading it. So first question, in the high frequency bench press templates you showed at the Corrupted Summit, how would you undulate reps? So if people are familiar, I did a full long form presentation at the Corrupted Summit seminar on high frequency bench pressing, which is now available on Powerlifting Now if you want to watch the full video. But I gave some templates there of what I would typically have someone do for 5 to 6 days a week bench pressing. And within that, answering this question of how would you undulate reps, I think I might have mentioned this in the Corrupted Summit seminar too. The higher the frequency, the less you're going to periodize and undulate rep schemes on any given day or all days as a whole. Once you get to 5 or 6 days a week, if all of these days are consistently changing rep schemes and going 8-7-6 or 9-8-7, and the main days are going 5-4-3, you're gonna have drastically different results, because some of those days, especially when you get up to 6 days, are very specific on what you need to prime and or recover based on that individual session. And I'm not gonna get into full detail there. That's where I talk about the presentation of what I mean in the sense of priming or recovery and how you lay out these sessions. So it is very, very common that if I am programming 5 to 6 days a week benching, 2 to 3 of those days never change. It may be always some tempo singles on a Thursday. It may always be 8s on a Friday. I may never change those rep schemes on any block because those are very specific on what I'm trying to do. And if I do change them, it's probably just undulating between 2 rep schemes of like 8s and 7s, 8s and 7s. I'm really not shifting too far away from the base format because that is what is working. Within that, on the main days, on like your primary or secondary day bench, that's where we may periodize a bit more, but still less than if you're benching 2 or 3 times a week. We may be shifting between 2 rep schemes, we may shift between 3 rep schemes, but only undulate the top sets and all the back off stay a certain volume load. Because again, the more you bench press and the more frequent you bench press, the less you should be periodizing the entirety of the setup, because it's very, very specific on what you need to do each day to be able to recover, stimulate, and then get stronger with doing that level of frequency. So next question we have is, what do you think of AMRAPs with the SBD lifts? So squat, bench, and deadlift. So if you're familiar with my channel, you probably noticed I really don't program AMRAPs for squat, bench, and deadlift. Now for accessories, definitely, but for squat, bench, and deadlift, no. And there's a couple reasons why. The first reason being the popularity of AMRAPs with squat, bench, and deadlift within powerlifting. A lot of that came from the idea of establishing a new estimated 1RM for a training max. And I don't really use training maxes that often. I mean, I may for like a light tertiary squat day or something like that, but all of the main work is more based off of other factors, whether it's just RPE, using past rep RPE or rep PRs to be able to adjust ranges for new blocks. I don't really use training maxes, as well as the fact that your E1RMs from AMRAPs are typically pretty inaccurate, because they are based a lot on how are you with higher rep sets usually, because AMRAPs usually is not like an AMRAP, it's not going to be 2 reps. It's usually going to be something you're going to hit for usually 5 reps or more when I usually see them applied. And so the E1RM you're going to get from that can be decently inaccurate. It can be accurate for the rep range you did, but it's not going to be accurate for your actual 1RM. So I'm not a fan of using that even for training maxes in the first place. And my other issue with AMRAPs is how you have to compensate technically with them. So like if you did an AMRAP with a leg press, that machine is stable. Your technique and the pattern you go in is already set in stone. I think that's a very safe way to do an AMRAP. If you're doing it with a squat, bench, and deadlift though, if you're doing an AMRAP and going to full on 10 RPE, as many reps as you can do, and you're truly going to that like level of failure and pushing it, your rep 1 through rep 12 is gonna look different. And I've heard some arguments, oh, you need to do that because that's gonna start putting you in positions that you're gonna be in like when you're trying to do a 1 rep max. I don't think that's the case. The reasons you compensate technique when you're doing a set of 10 to 12 on squat or deadlift is different than the reasons you're compensating on a 1RM. If you've actually ever done like a full out AMRAP 10 to 12 reps on squat and deadlift, it's exhaustion at that point. There's the pump, the legs are just swollen, the back is all pumped. Like the way you're compensating at that point is not the same. And frankly, I think it puts you in a somewhat compromising position. I'm not saying you're gonna get injured necessarily just because you do an AMRAP, but it's a position that you're not used to being in. And I don't think that's necessarily specific to the positions and the compensations you have when you're actually doing a 1 rep max, because the fatigue you're going through is a different type of fatigue. And so kind of going off AMRAPs and E1RM, the next question is in reference to your free program, what's the best way to test new 1RMs without the peaking block? And now I get this all the time. If you go to my free program, the comments are just littered with how do I do my 1RM and test my 1RM and all that kind of stuff. And actually, it is on my to-do list to make a full encompassing video for YouTube of how to be able to establish training maxes, because that's, even though I don't use them often, it is a very heavily asked question, especially for the demographic that tends to run free programs. With that being said, how do you test your 1RM if you're not using the peaking block? And I've mentioned this, if you go to the comments, I've answered this frequently. When you do a single at 9 RPE to end the free program on week 14, that is in a sense testing your 1RM. Yet you could push it to 10 RPE, that's fine with me, but I mean, in my own way I program, I usually don't have people truly max out if we don't have to. I'd rather them hit a single at 9 RPE and know that we have 7.5 kilos left in the tank, because of the training momentum that we can instill from that, and then the higher likelihood they're gonna have successful attempts in training because of that, because we know we're leaving a little bit in the tank. Because if you hit a single at 9 RPE, and let's say your max is 200, now you hit 202.5 at 9 RPE, and you're like, I know I can do more, awesome, we know you can probably do 207 to 210 if you were to do a meet and we were to fully test, but in training, we don't have to do that. We can know what your actual 1RM is by hitting a single at 9 RPE. So the next question is, what's something you've changed your mind on in the past year? And I get this pretty frequently. I think a lot of people, when they ask this question, they're wanting me to say something like, oh, I did a 180-degree flip where now I completely disagree with what I did before. And that's probably not gonna be the case. But there are things that I've changed my mind on where I've expanded my thought process or tools within my toolbox for certain things. And I think something over the past year that I've really kind of implemented and changed the way I do things is the process of deloading. I've obviously released videos on how to program deloads. I've done a wave load video, and then on Powerlifting Now in the near future, Marcellus Williams and I are doing a part 2 series on back-end deloading. And where I say that I've kind of changed my mind on this is I've definitely evolved. I mentioned that in the video I did, is the fact that I used to just kind of do in the block deloads. You do 4 weeks and you do a 5th week deload. And it wasn't because I thought that was the end all be all. I don't think I've ever said anywhere that like that was the only way to do things. It was, at least in the sense of how I was programming, the best tool that I understood how to utilize. And then I started to learn better how to wave load. And even with that, I still didn't feel like that gave me all the things I needed based on the different lifters I had to perfectly deload someone and like all the things I needed. And what really wrapped it all together was this idea of back-end deloading, which in short is where you go through, let's say your normal 4 weeks, and then maybe on your Thursday and Saturday session, which is like maybe your heaviest sessions of the block, you're gonna do your top sets, but then everything outside of the top sets is deloaded. You're tapering back volume and intensity on the back downs, you're tapering back accessories and all that kind of stuff. So you're hitting those peak lists, but you're taking away all of the back down work and the intensity there, because frankly, what happens a lot of times is that kind of gets disproportionately hard. You hit this big PR set of 3 at 9 RPE, and then even though the back down work is light, just like it usually is, it gets kind of disproportionately hard because of the mental drop off and also the possible actual fatigue accumulation that happened from that really, really heavy set. And then we see the entirety of the workout be disproportionately fatiguing. So I think the biggest thing is the implementation of that, the idea of back-end deloading, and then taking that plus wave loading plus regular deloading and knowing with who and what times I need to do each of them to really have the right programming for each individual lifter. Next question is, what's your success with the tallest lifter you have ever coached and what did you learn from them? So this is powerlifting. Let's be blunt, on average, most people who powerlift tend to be on the shorter end of the spectrum. Me being 6 foot, which I don't even think is tall within powerlifting. So I actually don't think I've coached a ton of people who I considered like truly tall. Let's call like 6'3" plus. But there is one very specific person I coached a while back, and all of it really comes down to distance travel. And actually at that point, that wasn't really a thought process that I had really thought about or knew about yet. The video I made on that was afterwards, but I could still see the similar practices of what I eventually kind of figured out within the distance traveled realm, is that this really tall lifter did really bad with rep work and was really disproportionately bad at it. Like if you gave them a set of 5 and what you thought they could do based off their 1 rep max, it would be horrible. They were really, really bad at it. So we did a lot more low rep work because they seemed to be really good with low rep work. And then second, what they could do for a 3 RM to a 2 RM to a 1 RM had really, really big gaps versus the opposite when you've got someone who's usually really short and really good with high rep work. What they do for their 3, 2, and 1 RM is actually pretty close. Like the percentage gap between them is really short. And like a lot of times you'll see them do a 2 rep max and then they can barely do more for their 1 rep max. What I found for this taller lifter, pretty much on all 3 lifts, is really, really, really big jumps. What they could do for their 2 RM, they can make a big jump for what they could do their 1 RM, and it all just goes back to distance travel. They had to do more range of motion and more work per rep, and so therefore, disproportionately, they were bad at higher rep work and they were better at lower rep work. Next question is a little bit longer. It's, do you sometimes just accept that someone's technique won't be as good as you'd like it to be or won't look the way you want it? For example, long arm benchers who really can't arch utilize leg drive as much as others. And the answer is yes, you just have to embrace it. We have this ideology of what technique should look like, and that is not how everyone is going to look. Most people, just like bell curve is a great example, most people are gonna be in the 70% spectrum of like looking a general way of how you should be squatting, benching, and deadlifting. And then on both ends, the opposite way, you're gonna have extreme outliers for what technique may be, where there's like some people who just look ridiculously perfect and they have ridiculous leverages for a lift, and some people who are just polar opposite and have horrible leverages. And no matter what you do, it is not going to look good. And as a coach, it can kind of be frustrating because you have this ideology of what should look good, and it's just not going to, and it doesn't mean anything wrong. That, for them, is how they should be lifting. With that being said, sometimes the normal cueing is not going to apply the same way to them because they can't move their body in the manner that that 70% can. And so what I'm going to do with those lifters more often is, one, allow them to self-align their technique a bit more, meaning just allow them practice to be able to squat, bench, or deadlift, whichever way kind of feels natural to them, which may not look natural in the scheme of what technique we think should look like, but for them it is. And then second, I'm going to give them more movement constraints, which is basically variations that are going to kind of constrain them to a certain pattern that is going to help them kind of find positions that are going to be optimal for them and feel best for them, and again, continue to allow them to self-align. Next question is reason for changing thumb grip on squats, i.e. your change with Nico. So what this is talking about is gripping on low bar squat with your thumb under the bar and fully gripping, or a thumbless grip. Nico used to have a thumbless grip and now he grips under the bar. This is a complicated topic. I have had it on my to-do list for a long time to make a full video on low bar grip and setup and all that kind of stuff because it's a pretty complex topic. And I hope by the end of the year to be able to actually have put that together and formulated and organize that in a way that I think is actually teachable. But to put this in short and understand the difference with thumb under versus thumb around the bar, there's a couple things we need to understand. When we go thumb under, what that is helping with is it's now allowing the bar to sit lower in our palm. When the thumb is under, and we're actually gripping the bar naturally has to sit higher in our hand. It cannot sit lower. So therefore, the effective distance of our forearm is now longer. And so that is why some people find that by going thumbless, they can feel a little bit better in position because they're going to find a little bit more room because the effective distance of the forearm is shorter. And then second, when we go thumbless, I keep saying thumb under, but thumbless, it allows us to extend our wrist a bit more so we can get a bit more under the bar versus when we grip it, usually our elbows are going to have to be a little bit higher. In certain instances, that could be a good thing. For Nico, and what I tend to bias to depending on the lifter, his issue is that too often you get too passive and you kind of get really extended, that wrist is really down, the elbows kind of go forward. You can see when I do that, like look at my back. My back is actually like rounded. I'm not really creating a shelf. And I think one of the most important aspects of the low bar squat is how can you set up to create the best shelf for the bar to sit on so that your back actually supports it and not your arms. And what Nico would experience is as the reps would go along, he'd get more and more protracted and rounded, and we get the bar rolling up on him. So I had him switch to a thumb under or a thumb grip because I wanted to create a bit more need for retraction, because by doing the thumb under, that's going to naturally push his hand back. When he went thumbless, he could really get that bar deep in his hands. His forearm could push forward. By going thumb under and gripping the bar, he had to get back. And now you can see as soon as I do that, I get more retraction and I get more of a shelf with my back. And then second, it causes a bit more of an irradiation effect. If you naturally grip something, just squeeze it, you'll feel all the way up your arm through your back, it starts to tighten up. And so when you actually grip something, you grip the bar on squat, you're gonna get a bit more of an irradiation effect where your upper back tightens. Now, that doesn't mean every lifter should go thumb under and grip the bar, but for Nico, that's the reason why we did it. Next question is, do you use a hierarchy when tinkering with variables, i.e. tinkering with volume, relative intensity, primary, secondary day, all that kind of stuff? So this could probably be a whole video, and it would take a bit to organize this whole hierarchy. But the main thing I'm gonna focus on is, as a powerlifting coach, I think the meta nowadays is limiting the limiting variables that we are having to manipulate. And there's really kind of probably three schools that people are in. There's a group that tends to keep the intensity or the weight on the bar pretty similar, and week by week or over a block, they're actually increasing volume. They might start at 3 sets of 5, and by the end of the block, they're at 5 sets of 5. So the main thing they're tinkering is volume while keeping the relative load pretty similar. There's a group that keeps more of a static RPE, emerging strategies type style, where it's the same microcycle setup and the same RPEs, everything week to week. And so really they're not limiting, they're really controlling all variables there in the sense of not manipulating anything week to week. And then myself, and especially if you follow Powerlifting Now, most of the guys on Powerlifting Now, the microcycle and the general volume, meaning the sets and reps, stay the same throughout the block. The main thing we're adjusting is the week-to-week progression and the peak intensity, relative intensity, and average intensity. So my answer to this is my hierarchy of probably what I'm looking and manipulating the most, looking to adjust, is the actual intensity stimulus and how we're applying that through a block, how we're applying that at a peak stage in the sense of top sets, how we're applying that through back off sets or ascending sets in the sense of average intensity, and then the exposure of that throughout the block. And that's really what I'm manipulating as my main go-to variable when I'm programming. So for the next question, we know priming the system with prior exposure can be great for many, but why? There's probably someone that could be better at answering this because I don't have a strong scientific background with the basis of kinesiology and exercise science. But probably this idea comes down to more of a neurological effect. We are doing something that is neurologically priming a future day of training. I don't think I have a good answer for why some people would be really, really good with doing a single, and then that primes a certain session a couple days later versus doing volume. That could probably be a whole video of kind of dissecting that. But what I will say is that it probably in some way leads to a similar theory or concept as post-activation potentiation. So if you don't know what that is, the base of that, at least the first readings I heard of it came from kind of like athletics, is doing something like a box jump to potentiate threshold motor unit recruitment, to then go squat with that already like primed motor unit recruitment. And the effects of post-activation potentiation have shown like a 28 to 48 hour effect of doing something like a box jump, actually priming something 24 to 48 hours later. In reality, when we do a single in our training, even if it's like 6 RPE, that has an aspect of post-activation potentiation. That actually was the first real program I ever wrote. I called it PAP, post-activation potentiation. It was all based around a single priming the rep set. But there's other issues that kind of play into there, is the mental drop-off, possible fatigue, other reasons that in powerlifting it doesn't translate one-to-one, because there's a big difference in doing a 500-pound squat to potentiate some rep work than doing a box jump. But either way, that's kind of what's happening in some way. Like we are creating some type of recruitment of motor units that has a potentiating effect 28 to 48 hours later that is then in some way increasing our strength on that day and priming it. And again, there's probably someone with a deeper science background that explain it better than me, but I think they would probably agree that it comes down to a similar concept or idea as the post-activation potentiation. Next question is, how different is programming men versus women? And I think my general ideas here differ from some, and I don't think it's different. It is, but it isn't. And what I mean by that is if you're used to coaching men and all of a sudden you get a female lifter, it doesn't just mean you should program different for her because she's a woman. Stronger by Science had a pretty detailed write-up about some physiological differences that are of why men and women differ in training stimulus. I don't know if I've seen that. I think the main reason doesn't come down to the sex difference. It comes down to the average body difference and mechanics. The average male is taller, weighs more, and lifts a little bit more on average. Obviously, there's some women that are stronger than men. I have some women I coach who are stronger than me. But on average, men are taller, larger, and tend to lift more than the average female. And because of that, it all comes down to the absolute load lifted and the distance traveled and the biomechanics of it. And that really is the difference. Like you very well could have a 75 kilo female who has very similar training to a 75 kilo male. Like I've had women who are closer in programming to some of my 100 kilo men than they are to my 48 kilo women and so forth. So what I'm trying to get at here is don't just assume because it's a man or a woman, they're just immediately going to be different. You have to look at all the factors here of the absolute load on the bar, the factors of their mechanics on how they're leveraged with squat, bench, and deadlift. Because you could have a 100 kilo male with a super high arch and a super short range of motion, and they're benching like your 48 kilo female does. It doesn't mean, it all comes down to the variables at play in the sense of distance traveled, absolute load lifted, and look at that. And then just on average, that is probably going to mean women on average are gonna be able to handle more like sets and reps because the total tonnage in the grand scheme of things is gonna be less because the absolute weight lifted is a little bit less, as well as because the average woman is shorter. That likely means they're gonna go through less distance traveled per rep on all those reps as well, which means the actual rep is less fatiguing per se. So that's the biggest thing. I try, if anyone comes to me and they're like, I've only coached women, now I'm coaching men, or I only coach men and now I'm coaching women, don't overly differentiate them. Look at them just like you would all the men of 120 kilo male to a 60 kilo male. They just have just as much differences as you're gonna see men to women, and it all comes down to those actual factors. Next question is a rundown of the best camera angles for squat, bench, and deadlift from a coach's perspective. So I'll put around the screen here as I'm talking some of the views that I'm talking about. But for squat, direct side view from knee height. That's specific because knee height is eventually where the hips are gonna be when you hit depth. Any higher or lower is gonna give a different vantage point. So direct side view from knee height, because that one is going to allow us to see depth, but two, it's gonna allow us to see bar path and all the mechanics from the front to back of what's happening with your center of mass. And then the second view is a direct front view from like hip height to knee height, so we can see the side to side symmetry and whatnot. For deadlift, we are going to do a direct side view from hip height because that's the anchor point. Just like the knee's the anchor point from the squat, that doesn't ever change height. The hips really don't change height too much. Like those are starting at a certain point and yeah, they're raising a little bit, but direct side view from around hip height, maybe knee height, and then direct front view. Again, from the side view, we're trying to see bar path, we're trying to see positioning, we're trying to see center mass, and the front view, we're trying to see side to side symmetry. And then on bench press, there's actually three views. One is a side view from bench height. That's to see the butt coming up, bar path, and all that kind of stuff. But the one issue with a side view on bench press is the plates really block everything. You can't really see the elbow position and whatnot. So that's why a kind of angled side view on bench press can be good, to where it's slightly angled back where your feet are, which I'll show a video here of how to do that, so that we can see the elbow position and touch point and pause and all that kind of stuff while still seeing a little bit of a side view. And then the other view, even before IPF bench depth was a thing, is a direct behind the head view. That is incredibly important to see the wrist stacking position, how the elbows are stacking, side to side symmetry, all that kind of stuff. So next question, in terms of purely coaching and not anything business related, what do you think is the most overlooked aspect of coaching? Or what do you think the most overlooked aspect of coaching is? I don't think this is something that hasn't been talked about, but I still think it's overlooked, is it is paramount that a powerlifting coach also has a decent understanding and knowledge base of injury and rehab. Because if you are deciding to powerlift, you are pushing your body to an extreme. You are going to have aches and pains that are completely normal and that are not really injuries. They're going to happen. You're lifting really, really heavy weights. It's going to happen. And even injuries are going to happen that are likely within the scope to an extent of a powerlifting coach. Because a lot of these injuries are coming back to the programming the coach is giving you. So if the coach doesn't know enough about injury or rehab, how are they going to be able to adjust the program or know if they need to adjust the program based on the aches or pains you are having? Or they could be possibly sometimes technique related. And if a coach doesn't understand biomechanics and like why certain positions or techniques may be causing asymmetrical distribution of stress to certain muscles and overly taxing something that now is getting overused and now injured because of it, how are they going to have any idea how to be able to manipulate that? Within that, there are points when it starts to get outside the scope of the powerlifting coach and it needs to see a rehab professional. But that rehab professional is pretty useless. I shouldn't say they're useless. They're doing a great job, but it's pretty useless because if the coach doesn't know what they're doing in the sense of injury and rehab, once that lifter leaves the rehab professional, is feeling better and goes back to the coach, they're just going to get injured again because the coach is going to have them go back to doing the same things they were already doing before. They don't understand why it happened in the first place, so they can't make adjustments to be able to fix things. And it's just going to be this ping pong of get injured, see a PT, get injured, see a chiropractor, get injured, get your massage work. And it's a never-ending cycle because the coach doesn't know what to adjust. So it is paramount to have a baseline of knowledge and understanding of injury and rehab as a powerlifting coach because it 100% is going to be within your scope of practice to understand how to adjust workload, exercise selection, rep ranges, programming, technique to be able to help someone who's struggling with aches and pains and what needs to be adjusted to get them out of that pain. All right, and so the last question is, what were your mistakes when starting to powerlifting coach? So I've been powerlifting coaching now for 7-8 years full-time in some capacity, really full-time in the last 5 or 6 years where it's all I do. And there were some mistakes. I mean, if you've watched my business videos on coaching, I think that covers a lot of the things that I would talk about here. But I'll give you 3 specific things that if I was to go back that I should, not that I think I made a mistake, but I needed to evolve sooner. And the first one is not having strict work times or office hours. I spent too long of a time pretty much responding at any hour of the day that I was awake to clients. And I should have way sooner buckled down of having set office hours of when I'm going to be responding and a certain time that I'm putting my phone down, I'm not on my computer, and I'm just spending time with my wife and having a normal life. Because the issue with powerlifting coaching or just owning a business and being an entrepreneur in general is you work 7 days a week and you set your own hours. And a lot of times you always feel like you need to be doing something. And so I've had office hours and work times for about 3 years now, but honestly, that should have started years earlier. And I was overextending myself too much. The next mistake was being too worried about price increase. I stuck at way too low a pricing for way too long. I was too scared to let it ramp up, which I think is pretty much every powerlifting coach ever. And then frankly, once I got the confidence with my pricing, I probably made too big of jumps after that. Like I had this very small jump. I wasn't increasing pricing. And then I went from that to like big jumps in pricing. And I wish it would have kind of evenly spaced out a bit more, or I should have started out and known my worth a bit more from the get-go. The biggest thing is understand your value. If you're providing a good service, you're worth the money. Don't be scared to increase your pricing. Research what other coaches are charging and understand kind of the industry norms and be confident in charging that yourself. And then the last mistake was being too worried about dropping a lifter. Because frankly, if you're a coach for long enough, you're going to drop a lifter. You're going to have issues to where they're going off program, they're not communicating, whatever it may be, you're going to have to drop a lifter. And I probably, earlier in my career, way too often let people get away with too much because I was worried about if I drop this lifter, I don't have anyone to replace them. And if I don't have anyone to replace them, that is lost money. And that is a scary thought especially when you are not a coach who can just like immediately say, I have a spot open and have 50 people reach out wanting that spot. It was scary. Like when you only get an inquiry once every couple months, it's scary to want to drop a lifter knowing that revenue is going away. But I wish I wouldn't have cared. I wish I would have just said, I have standards, this is what has to be done, and if you're not going to meet it, I'm going to drop you. And the reason being is because one lifter, one bad apple, can affect your relationship and your attitude to all of your clients. You might coach 35 people and 34 are doing great, but one bad apple is gonna sour your taste for your entire work. It's gonna feel like that person is taking up all of your time. It's gonna feel like you're doing the work of 10 athletes in one, and it's not worth affecting the service for the other 34 people because one person won't follow the rules. I'd rather drop them, provide better service to the other athletes, and know if they're getting good service, the inquiries are gonna come. The word of mouth is gonna spread, people are gonna see the results, those clients are gonna tell their friends how good things are going, and that spot's gonna be filled. In the short term, I might be losing the revenue, but in the long term, I'm gonna be better off because of it. All right, so that concludes the Q&A. So if you enjoyed that, comment below, let me know if it's something that you want me to keep doing. This could be something that I do every couple months because it's really easy to put together. I'll just be posting on my Instagram, fielding questions and be able to answer them here where obviously you can see I can answer them in more detail and hopefully give some more insight. So if you like this video, make sure to give it a like. If you're not subscribed, do that, and then share the video if you found it useful to some of your friends. Otherwise, until next time, peace.